Hi, this is Stu Stover again. Today I wanted to get into the topic of consumer choice. Okay, so in a capitalist system, your economic decisions, my economic decisions, make enormous consequence. So much of the GDP is actually based on your spending, my spending. And so the choices we make are astonishingly important. It dictates what products we buy, which companies are successful, which ones fail. Lots of examples of them. I mean, the old days, there was an example of VHS and beta. Now this goes back before CDs and before the current technology, so none of this is relevant particularly today, except the lesson is true. So one of the things that happened, Sony had a beta system, which was actually superior to VHSs and those kinds of tapes. But because beta came after, an awful lot of people had already invested a fair amount of money in VHS tapes, but also VHS machines, and the difference in how much better betas were wasn't that much better than the VHS. I don't know. So the answer is beta failed. It failed not because they weren't a better product, but because they weren't first to market and there wasn't as much advantage. And so our choices in terms of what we choose, why we choose what we do, is astonishingly important. We would say the same thing about what food we buy, what beer people consume, ice cream. Pick a product, it doesn't matter. Our choices matter. And so this is actually an extension of our supply and demand model that we've been working on. And so the producers will put a bunch of supply into the marketplace at particular price points in order to sort of encourage certain levels of demand. That's why advertising is important. That's why brand loyalty is important. That's why all sorts of things matter, because it affects how you and I end up making the choices we do. Why do we spend more for one product versus another? All that stuff is very much part of the deal. Utility is how the economists will describe this process. And so the assumption is, in utility, you and I derive a certain level of satisfaction from purchasing a particular product. And again, it doesn't matter, it could be a car, it could be a truck, it could be ice cream, it could be, it doesn't matter. And so the issue is we derive utility, or I think easier to understand, we achieve a level of satisfaction from those kinds of purchases in terms of what we do. So why do we go to Disney versus going, so the choices are endless for you and I in terms of how we do this. And so utility is simply a measure to try and figure out how we do this. Well, economists are overly committed to trying to figure out how to quantify decision-making process. Frankly, I'm a little confused in terms of how you would actually do some of that stuff. But it's, you understand why they would want to, though, because then if we can say, well, yes, people value this X amount more than that, then they get more satisfaction. Anyway, it gets complicated as they slide into this. But the issue here is actually not just utility. It's something called marginal utility. And margin, economists always say that decisions are made at the margin. It's not the first issue that we go after, but it's as we get to the further out there, how does that work? And how do we make that decision out on the margin? So we'll come back to this in a second. They came up with some crazy measure called utils, and as if one util and it represents one level of satisfaction and it's the same for everybody. I think that's a little screwy, but we understand the premise. Okay, so let me use an example here, guys, that I think you will be able to appreciate. Back when I was your age, we had a whole bunch of ice cream shops. And almost all of them had something that was referred to in, whatever they use for the description, the advertising, whatever, but a dare to be great. And so you had this huge container of ice cream with 20 scoops, and typically bananas and cherries and whipped cream and all the other stuff, chocolate syrup, whatever, would be on this 20 thing. And if you could eat all 20 scoops of ice cream, finish that off, they'd take your picture hanging on the wall. Yes. We actually have a TV show that apparently is still on, Man versus Food, where this guy goes in and he tries to eat a 6-pound burrito or whatever it is he's trying to eat, and then that's kind of an American phenomena in some sense, that we would do such things. And so let's think about that. You're hungry. You go in and you order this 20 scoop thing. All right, which of those 20 scoops are you going to eat first? And the answer is probably the one you like the best. And you'll eat that one. How good is that? And the answer is pretty good. How about the second one? The second one's pretty good. Maybe not quite as good as the first one, but still pretty good. The third one, the fourth one, at some point, what starts to happen? And if you've ever watched the show Man vs. Food, there's a point where you see him sweating in the back in agony because he's only half done with his burrito. How much satisfaction is he deriving from that next bite? The answer is it's now negative. And so what you get is a diminishing return. We call this the law of diminishing returns. So doing one more, whatever that one more is, okay, that one more is marginal. It's the next one that we do. What's the satisfaction in this case of eating that one more in terms of your law of diminishing returns? And at some point, what might you do as you get over here to the other end of this process? Okay, the folks who naively go into the hot dog eating contest, and what happens to them after they've consumed 45 hot dogs? They go throw up. How much fun is that? And normally we would argue that that is not satisfaction at all. It's actually pain and suffering. So the notion here is that we try to measure utility against, how much benefit do we actually derive from that purchase, or the next purchase, or the next purchase, whatever that marginal side is. Let me give you another dumb example here. I went over fishing with a friend of mine over on the west side of Michigan a couple years ago. And he had got a boat, and we were going out to catch salmon or trout or whatever we were going out to catch. And we drove by this marina. And this marina was absolutely packed with boats, sailboats, bigger boats of all, various kinds. And he said, only 2 boats have left this marina this year. And it was already into June, so you'd think a lot of those boats would be out. But what he said is that the first year that people bought those boats, they took them out 6-8 times, almost every weekend, every other weekend. What happens the second year? Well, maybe 4 to 6 times a summer. The third year, maybe 2 to 4 times. By the fourth year, if they get out once, that's probably a lot. So you spend a lot of money, and what do you get? Well, the first year you get a fair amount of satisfaction from having that boat. And then what happens in subsequent years? Less and less satisfaction, less and less value, a lot of work, repairs, expense, and the satisfaction is going to go down in the law of diminishing returns. So there's a ton of issues here. The law of diminishing returns actually shows up in a wide variety of situations. It happens in the business community, so we need to produce more goods. So what do? You hire more people, you put them out there, and you already had a fairly efficient system for producing X number of goods every hour, whatever it was. As you add more people, eventually, if you keep adding people, they're getting each other's way, they're standing around, the efficiency of the system will suffer. And so law of diminishing returns, it's not necessarily you just add one more and you get one more, the same level of satisfaction or same level of production, the same level of whatever as you did with the first one. So again, marginal matters in econ. You better have a good understanding of marginalness in terms of understanding this stuff. So let me slide to a slightly different issue. All right, how do you feel about found money? Okay, what's found money? It lands in your lap out of the blue. You find it on the street, it shows up that you didn't expect it. It's not your paycheck. It's not what you use to pay your bills. It's found money. Okay, so a great example is, of course, the lottery. So if you win the lottery, even if it's $1,000 or $500, same principle as winning piles and piles of money, is that it's found money. So you're not necessarily going to spend it to pay down your debts. You're going to use it for lots of other kinds of, quote, fun things, because it's not necessary for your bills. And so it is an interesting phenomenon how we tend to think in our heads about different categories of money that is going to show up. So what that typically means is we're getting to the notion of disposable income versus mandatory spending. Okay, what's mandatory spending? You got to pay your mortgage, you got to pay your rent, you got to pay your car payment, you got to pay your car insurance payment. All these things are expenditures that are in the category of mandatory. You don't pay them, there are big consequences. But then there's another category for the money that is left over that is called disposable income. And how can we use our disposable income? Well, we can go out to dinner, we can go to the Detroit Tigers baseball game, we can, go to the concert, we can buy more beer, we can, there's a whole bunch of things that we can do with that money because it's not mandatory. So one of the big issues here, law of diminishing returns, it's hard to sort out exactly what we should do with our money and in the various categories of how we think about our money. That's why it's called behavioral economics. It's related to how we think about the economics of making choices. The last thing I'm going to add here on this one is we also have a category called consumables and durables. And this is real important, more in macro than it is micro, but works both ways actually. A consumable, okay, if we lose our job, our income is cut back in substantial ways, there's still things that we have to buy. We got to buy diapers for the kids, we got to buy milk, we got to buy gas for the car, we got to, So you've got all these things that are consumables, that it doesn't matter if your economic standard is high, low, you're still going to spend the money. So the question then is, how do we think about this behavioral economics model in times when we don't have as much money? Okay, when you don't have as much money, or you're uncertain about the future, a real important concept in econ, how we think about the future, we're going to stop purchasing durable goods. Okay, and maybe not stop, because if the refrigerator goes out, you don't have a choice, you got to replace the refrigerator. But are you going to replace it just because you don't like the color? No. Durable goods in bad times, when we don't have the extra money, we tend to defer those economic decisions until we get a little bit more certainty about what we think the future is going to be. Because durable goods, you buy on credit typically. And so you're using your credit card, you're paying interest on those things. And if you think the future is bright, you don't have a problem going ahead and spending the money because, down the road you're going to make more money. You'll be able to pay that off without a big deal. But if the future's not quite so clear, it's going to be bright, you're nervous that you're going to accumulate these mandatory expenditures and your income may not be high enough to be able to handle that. And so the notion of understanding consumables and durable goods and how we as humans make these economic decisions about how we go about spending money matters. So lots of interesting issues here. Hopefully some of you are interested in the behavioral side of this, because we get into psychology, other disciplines that help us understand how we make sense of these issues. Thank you very much.